I don't know of any other option. Someone knows one, we can put it in the pool and take a look. But whatever option we choose, if we want to continue to get funding through the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, we must prove that the assessment is aligned with our standards. Otherwise, you forfeit the Elementary Secondary Education Act funding, or you take penalties. That's an absolute requirement.
And what are the penalties?
Well, sometimes what the penalties, typically the first penalty is conditions, and the conditions say you will have an assessment within this many years, and then there's monitoring, and that monitoring usually means some periodic level of monitoring to prove that we're on that path. So they usually start with conditions, and then you prove you're going to get there within a time frame. They also, Nebraska was in this situation, and I believe the threat before Nebraska said, okay, we're tired of fighting with you, is they made the choice to shift, but I believe they were going to withhold, and I'm doing this off of memory, I thought it was 20% of their ESEA funding. And at that point they said, we will move to an assessment. And they had to shift their entire program. Nebraska is the only one that had that level under the prior funding and assessment regime for No Child Left Behind. Then so what we're doing is actually, we intend to put out a request for proposals, an RFP, in the very near future. And what we intend to learn from that, and actually maybe even lock in a vendor, is one of three things. First off, if you participate in an assessment consortium, and we are advisory only, not governing, with the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium, there are certain things they provide at a cost, and I'm going to go over the costs in a little more. And then there are certain things you still need to pay for. In other words, you get your items from the consortium. You even get a test from the consortium. But they don't administer the test to your students, and they don't bring the test back and score them, and they don't then produce score reports to go to parents and families. So you have to get a vendor to do that. So there's certain things they provide, certain things you still need a vendor for. We're calling those wraparound services. You wrap it around the services you get from the consortium. So we're going to ask to try to get 3 pieces of information in this one RFP, or go multiple routes to get the information if we have to. We want to find out, so what would those wraparound services cost? That way we know, is this an efficient approach and does it make sense? What does it cost to completely build our own assessment, just like we have now, aligned to our standards? So we can find out. I've guessed, based on history of building our last assessment and inflation proving it, but I don't know that that guess is right. The best way to find out if that's right, put a request for proposals out. And then the third choice is, are there published products that a vendor could say, yes, it's aligned to your standards, and here's how we'll prove it to you, and this is how we can show how your students compare to other students nationally, because that's a question people want to know. So we hope to put the RFP out in probably the 3rd to 4th week in August. This is a big RFP, and many states are actually going out to RFP right now to lock down their vendors for 2015. So we want to have a good response, so we anticipate a 6-week window on that. That way we give time to actually, I'll just tell you the first time we did an RFP in this line when I was at the department, it was 2 very thick binders full of information. It takes a lot of work for a company to put these together, so it will take that long. So I anticipate that going out, though, in the probably around the 3rd week of August. And so when we get that information back and score those, we'll learn about the quality of vendors available and the efficiency, or maybe lack thereof, of doing any one of those options. Another piece that is important is technology readiness. And so we're actually engaging in a process with our current test vendor who does do online testing in other states, not in ours, to determine if we had to do a test using technology, how ready are we? And right now we're using information from the WorkKeys assessment, which is online in many districts, not all but most. We are using information that districts supply through their application for E-rate, which tells us broadband and tells us how many machines they have. We're then going to add to that an actual tool that allows the district to turn on every one of their machines and actually go online to a tool that our vendor has that will check the readiness, whether that machine could run an assessment that we anticipate coming out. And the reason we have to do this is not only are these consortium products online, but commercial products, one tool in particular called Aspire that's being developed by ACT that Alabama has decided that they were going to use, it's an online assessment. So almost any direction you go now, you really need to figure out whether you could do that. If it is online, your price comes down because the paper pencil is very expensive. You have to produce the paper pencil, you have to ship it all over. That adds a lot of cost. We may find that what we're in a situation in Alaska, though, is that we're giving some online, some paper pencil. We're going to just work to see where we're at with that as we move that forward.
Richard Reinbold?
Really, a question in regards to this. You said we have not adopted Common Core. We've adopted the Alaska standards, which are about 90%. To maintain state control, it just seems logical to build our own tests. I know that you're trying to figure that out if that's right. Because when I was at NCSL in Denver a couple months ago, they said that we would be, if we adopted the Smarter Balance, we would be writing our checks to UCLA. I specifically asked the vendor, and that's what they said. As a state government, we would be writing, our checks to them because they would be the person, coordinating these efforts. So I'm sure some of the people in the legislature may have a challenge with that. So can you give an estimate? You said that you may have one. That's why you're going to do an RFP of what it would cost for the state, so we can maintain control, so we can maintain that diversity across the state.
If I could answer that when I get to slide 11, I think that answers that.
Go ahead, continue.
And I'll go a little bit deeper based on your question about that.
Hopefully this isn't that deep. What is our deadline that we have to, what's the date deadline that we have to have an assessment in place? Or at least tell them, here's who we're going to have, and we're moving down that road.
Well, if we're going to build our own assessment, we should have had it in place a year ago. We should have been on that path a year ago. We could probably do it. I don't know that we could get it built by.
But when do we have to have one? What's that drop dead date?
When's the first time it'll be
for the
due?
spring of 2015 is when we need an assessment.
Is there a specific date?
We usually give it in the spring. So when do we have to have it in place?
Okay.
It depends on the type of product you use. If you're building your own, I built a test in 14 months, and anyone who was teaching in 2005 will remember how miserable that was.
I guess my point is, according to to the federal government, if you will, they haven't put a specific date that you have to have a test. You just have to have it as a test ready by spring.
But
that
spring
aligns.
2015.
Got it. Okay.
So the next slide is, I'm going to just dig a little bit deeper into SBAC because we're advisory. Again, I want to be clear, we haven't made the decision, but the decision does have to come pretty soon because there's a lot of work to getting ready to give an assessment. So SBAC stands for Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium. It's one of two consortiums that are out there. You'll hear news about both consortiums. Matter of fact, news on PARC came out this week, and theirs costs more per student than what the SBAC one would cost. I'll be getting into costs, like I said, on slide 11. We chose the SBAC option because it was closer aligned to our current program. It has a summative assessment very much like what we currently do. We had to, though, to be able to adopt or be able to use or be able to be a member of that consortium, we had to show that our standards were sufficiently aligned to what's being developed. We had to have a third party do that work. So we had a third party do it called the Council of Chief State School Officers, who actually helped develop the Common Core. And so it made sense to go to someone who really knows the Common Core to say, well, what's the same and what's different. There's not exact alignment, but there is sufficient alignment to say that if you use that assessment, you would be able to warrant results that are going to be appropriate. The other thing is Alaska chose to become a member as advisory versus governing because there's more future obligations in governing. There's a greater commitment in governing, and we weren't ready to make that commitment. But the only way to really find out what's going on is to get access into the door to the meetings, and that's what advisory allowed us to do. Now I learn about SBAC nearly every day in my emails. Prior to becoming advisory, we didn't know what they were doing. So this just allowed us to learn what's going on so we could make a decision. A little bit more about Smarter Balance. There are pricing structures that would allow you to participate just on the summative assessments, which is what the state does right now. There's also a pricing structure that says you could do more than that. We don't know whether we would do more than that or not. Let me just talk about what those two things are. A summative assessment is, again, it's in grades 3 through 8 and grade 11. A state could choose to add grade 9 and 10 if the state chose, but the tests that are being made that would actually meet the requirements of the Elementary Secondary Education Act requirements are in grades 3 through 8 and 11. Why 11? They tried to pick something closer to being exiting from high school so that they could really do a determination on are you college and career ready. Feeling 10th grade is a bit early for that decision, and actually spring of 12th grade often is too late for a couple of reasons. Once kids have chosen what college they're going to and made that decision, they're not going to take a test in high school all that seriously. The other piece is you still have some time to do something if you take the test in 11th grade. And so there were some specific reasons for choosing 11th grade. The comprehensive assessment, similar to our current assessment program, it's computer-based and adaptive. Adaptive is a new term, so let me just describe quickly what it means. Adaptive means the student, when they take this assessment, if they're doing it on the computer, they take a few items that are the same as every student taking that grade level test. And then it determines how well is that student doing, and it either, if they're getting all those items right, the items then get progressively more difficult. So the test not only determines what grade level they're at, or excuse me, whether they're proficient at the grade level they're taking the test for, but what would the student actually be proficient if they moved into the next grade level or more difficult items. Does the same for if a student gets all those wrong, it's going to actually go to less difficult questions, so you'd be able to say the student is not proficient and they appear to be performing about a grade level behind. That's what adaptive does. That's one of the things that is allowed by a test that many of our districts choose to give called the MAPS, the Measure of Academic Progress. So many districts give that. That's an adaptive test. The paper pencil version obviously won't have that. The paper pencil will be available under SBAC for only 3 years, and it does come at an extra cost. The state would have to pay those costs. The idea behind this is that it be college and career ready. So you work closely with your university, you work with career-type programs with the intent that if a student is proficient, that ought to suffice that all things being equal, which lives of young people is not all things being equal always, they would be able to go into credit-bearing courses at the college or into certificate programs at your trade schools. And so we've worked very closely with those as we develop the standards, as we move into any assessment, whether it be this one or one of our own or a published product, we'd want to work closely with the university. That's the replacement program if you go with SBAC. The addition, which comes at additional cost, which the state may or may not choose to bear. It may be if districts want to do this, then districts can pay to do this extra cost just like they do with the MAPS right now, which is an assessment districts choose to give, is these what are called interim and formative assessments. The interim ones are designed so that if you wanted to not wait till the end of the year to give an assessment, but you wanted to give one in the fall and one in the winter, you actually can get they're shorter, and you can get a picture of, is this student on track to do well on the assessment at the end of the year? And that's why districts give local assessments. The formative is actually tools that teachers would use maybe to give a very, very quick and short assessment in the classroom that actually tells them how on track are these kids on this, and literally would cause them to change instruction tomorrow because kids are off track.
Representative Drummond, do you have a question?
Yes, I did, Madam Chair. Thank you. On the computer-based adaptive tests, is whether a school district chooses to go with that dependent on adequate broadband access and the number of computer stations, or is it and if paper and pencil is that much more expensive, how many of our districts would be forced to spend more money on paper and pencil if they couldn't do the technology-based versions?
Through the chair, Representative Drummond. First off, in terms of how many, it really is going to depend on that technology readiness that I spoke of, that piece. So we won't really know who is ready probably for a few months, and that's assuming they continue to keep their technology up, which districts are working always, of course, I think, to do. But so we'll learn that within a couple of months. Currently, we don't charge any cost to the district in terms of paper, pencil versus online if they go that option. WorkKeys is a test that is one or the other, but WorkKeys actually charges the same amount for both. This won't, I don't believe this will be that way. We'll learn that through that RFP also. But we currently don't charge the districts, and I don't know that the state would charge the districts if they go paper, pencil. I do know of another state that actually has asked all their districts to get technology ready, and if they aren't technology ready and they have to use paper, pencil, the districts are going to have to pay for that paper, pencil. I don't think that's a dialogue we've entered into in the state, and I don't think there would be much interest in that, but I might be wrong. So it would actually be an added cost for the state's contract with the assessment vendor.
Okay, so the state would absorb the cost if there was a difference.
That is the way I'm moving forward in the preparation of this and working with staff at the department to prepare that. But if it's another direction, a decision made in the other direction, that hasn't been made at this time.
Thank you.
Representative Gaddis.
I can't help but hear you talk about costs and who's paying, things like that. At the end of the day, who makes the choice on which way we're going to go and how much we're going to spend?
Through the chair, Representative Gaddis, what we feel obligated as a state to give is the summative assessments, because that's what's required. If we actually found that the pricing of all of this included this interim and formative could come in at what we're currently spending on assessment, well, we could make that choice to participate in that if the administration was comfortable with that. But we'd also probably want to have a lot of dialogue with the legislature, because that would be saying that we're now adding something to this that is a choice and not a statutory requirement. My guess is the summative will probably work. Well, I'll get more into price on the next slide. And
okay, I wasn't sure if I got ahead of myself.
What I think we would probably do, based on my read of a crystal ball, is the summative is going to probably come in nearly the same price. So the formative is tools that the state has never bought before and probably wouldn't buy now, but we would make it available for districts to somehow do a license that they could get access to it. It's a little bit tricky, because if you're in these consortiums, they do work with states. They don't work with districts. So we'd have to figure out a fee structure, how that would work. But that could all be sorted out. That's just a technical issue.
And I guess here's the crux of my question. Is it possible that DEED could make a commitment for the state of Alaska for millions and billions of dollars without going through the legislature?
The only way that we could do that, no, not in additional dollars. If we went out to bid and we found out that the assessment was going to cost $250,000 more in 2 years out versus the current year, I think there would probably be some dialogue we'd have to have with the governor's office and OMB, but that's about the increases we've been dealing with our current assessment program. So I think our view would be to analyze that and say, well, that's not really out of line with where we were going with our current program. If it was a lot more than that, I think we'd have to be having some pretty heavy dialogue about that, because it's a much greater investment than what our current program is costing.
I think I'd like to remind the committee, you're legislators, and you do the appropriation. So DEED could commit, and they could sign up on an RFP. They wouldn't have to come through us to sign the RFP, and they could do it for $20 million. But if they came before us next year for $20 million and we chose to give them $5 million, they would have to determine out of their own budget, or they would get the $15 million. So we can't necessarily tell them what to sign or not to sign unless within statute, as the chair of the Education Committee might determine. how they might want to do that, but as long as it says that the state is going to do the assessment, the department will decide how to do that assessment, sign what they believe with the governor on what they think we can swallow, but at the end of the day, it will determine on the budget process whether or not those dollars are given, and I think they're very aware of that, and I guess I just want to take a moment too with Representative Reinbold. A lot of this has come from our last few years from our committee as far as making their own test, and the concern from the committee previously has been not just making our own tests, but making our own cut scores, in which many parents who have then moved to other states have found that their children do not perform at the same level. So to be fair with our ever-moving population, especially with the military we so love, especially Eielson, that I had to put in because she's going to house them as they move here, is that are we being fair to our children here if we don't ever have some type of testing in which we can do some type of comparison? So not that they couldn't go to doing their own, but I think this committee has been one of probably the most vocal ones on not being very happy that it just doesn't seem like, and the NAEP has kind of shown us that as well, that we are really bringing our children to a level in which we need to. Now, that doesn't mean we couldn't make our own tests and we couldn't have higher cut scores and make that happen, but that was the past.
Right, and I understand, through the chair, I understand that, but it would be nice to evaluate the percentage of students. I looked at a recent just snapshot, and it said about 2% of the people actually are moving out of the state. So I don't want to, lose our state control for a handful of students that are leaving, the state. I think it's really important that we maintain state control, and that would definitely be something that I would like looked at. And also, they keep talking about this pencil and paper thing. Well, what about the cost of the computer and the broadband and all of that? Who's going to absorb the cost? I mean, in all these 53 districts, it's going to be extremely expensive to get these computer-generated and computer assessments done. So, I mean, I think that's really, really important to assess the cost of that.
Well, it would be my intent to bring back once they have that information and bring them back and find out whether or not there's a lot of districts that, I mean, it may come back that there's only a couple of districts. We may need to have that conversation with those legislators in those areas. So we'll put that on the calendar as soon as they get that to come back and let us know what kind of readiness we're actually in.
I mean, that's really what we're trying to do is figure those things out. So the assessment costs, here's where I've laid these things out. So in terms of the assessment costs, if we went with the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium, is SBAC provides the assessments. So the items and the test engine for electronic testing and analysis is provided by that consortium. And they estimate that those costs would cost about $6.20 per student for the summative only assessment, not the formative added to it, the formative and interim. So about $6.20. Then you'd have to get a vendor who would be required for the wraparound services, which would include the administration of the assessment, the scoring of the assessment, the recording of the assessment, data analysis tools so that districts get all their data so they can take a look at results and those kinds of things. All the things that our current assessment program does that SBAC wouldn't do. Our current standards-based assessment costs us approximately $50.43 per student. We estimate, this is a broad estimate, and an RFP is a better way to get the costs, but we sat down, we looked, and we said, we had to do paper pencil, and we had to use our current vendor and what they charge in all these categories, and we lined that up. We literally lined up, here's what SBAC would do at their $6.20 per student. Here's everything that they don't do that a vendor charges. We looked at the current vendor charges that they charge us in those categories, and we came up with this could cost us $49.24 per student, about what we're paying right now, a little bit less actually. So that's our guess. That's all that is a guess, because the only way you find out what the competitive market is to do a competitive process through an RFP. So that's what drove us to, let's do an RFP. That's the only way we can find this out. Now, earlier, Representative Reinbold asked about UCLA in particular. What happened is SBAC was a consortium of states. They came together and they sought a federal grant through Race to the Top money. About $350 million went to two different assessment consortiums of Race to the Top money. That's about 10% of all the Race to the Top money went to those two consortiums. The rest went to states that applied. We did not. Their obligation was to build an assessment, but that grant ends in September 2014, on the last day of September 2014. So they had to figure out, well, what do we do after that if these states want to use this test? Well, what those states that are governing states in SBAC is actually went to say, well, where could we have this product land and charge us only $6.20 to run the program and build that assessment? And the decision by the governing states, through some process they went through, we're not a governing state, so we didn't participate in that, was it will land at UCLA. Why UCLA? Well, it has a big education center there that does work around assessments. It's a place called, and I'm sorry I cannot remember the acronym, I wasn't prepared for this question, but it's called CREST, C-R-E-S-S-T, I think. And it's a division within UCLA. And they've been doing assessment work for years. Well, that's where the governing states of SBAC decided this could live, and the estimated cost of participating would be $6.20 per student. They actually estimate the whole cost of this assessment if you take your SBAC cost and your vendor cost and you do everything online at $20.50 per student. We think that's low, but maybe it's not. We'll find out through the RFP process. So that's what we know about SBAC and its costs and where it will, and that's how it landed at UCLA CREST, which is part of UCLA. But the RFP will give us the real information. And then lastly, I just want to share, what are the implications of the waiver? We adopted new standards. We had to adopt a new test. To get the waiver, we had to agree to test by 2015. That's the only thing we did in the waiver, is agree that we test in 2015. We thought maybe at one point we shouldn't test till 2016, giving us more years. So the one thing that we agreed to that we wouldn't have already agreed to is to test in 2015. We might have put it off to 2016. So that's the only waiver implication. So next we're going to get into educator evaluation. And we actually have two more components and then the pricing. So I mentioned that with the chair.
Mr. Josephson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It seems to me, Mr. Morse, if a state was sensitive about its sort of sovereign interests and its individualized approach to testing and assessment, it would be more sensitive about the standards in the assessment. Is that? I mean, at some point, if a governing body has an assessment, you can look at it and say, yep, that certainly tests the standards that we've prepared for the 229 stakeholders or whatever. That's the thing that you'd be more sensitive about, wouldn't you? Not you'd want to make sure the assessment was right, but assuming it was right, I'm just trying to think, is there an Alaska way? I suppose there would be with indigenous populations, but is there an Alaska way to assess the standard? It just seems like it's an assessment.
Through the chair, Representative Josephson, I think the question really comes down to who owns the product at the end of the day, who can walk away with it, who can control the length and those kinds of things. The questions that we have, if we did a custom-developed test, would not look a lot different than the questions that SBAC is developing. Matter of fact, one of the contractors for developing items is a company called CTB McGraw-Hill. Well, they didn't have the capacity to do all the work themselves, so they subcontracted with a company called DRC, or Data Recognition Corporation. That's our test vendor. They've developed our items. They're now developing SBAC items. The items would be much the same regardless of what tests you use. It's just who owns it. Does a consortium own it? Does the state own it? Or does a publishing company own it and you're leasing it? And I don't know about all the other feelings that are behind that. There may be lots of concerns, but that's my perspective on it. It's who owns it at the end of the day.
Go ahead, Rachel.
Quick question. And in this RFP, I assume that for special ed and so on, that the testing will be more costly. I'm just making that assumption. But are you addressing that in the RFP?
For, through the chair, Representative Gaddis, for students who are in special education who take the regular assessment, I would actually say those costs are costs that probably wouldn't be different than they are now, but they're locally borne costs of actually trying to do accommodations for lots of different students. So those costs will be much the same as what they are now, and there are costs behind that, but it's locally.
But you are addressing that, and when you go out with the RFP, you're asking what that'll cost.
Right, through the chair, Representative Gaddis, in terms of what that vendor costs are, and in terms of the work they would have to do in terms of any different type of scoring because of how that's accommodated, yes, that's correct.
Question Reingold? Okay.
This is a little bit of a complicated question, but teachers oftentimes will test to an assessment, not necessarily to a standard. And I'm hoping that you, as a state board, will be making sure that they are the standards, not the assessment, so the teachers don't get caught up with the assessment. Well, let's just have a question right now. Like, let's say you adopt, or the state adopts standards that are very anti-development standards, and then there's tests where you have to, on the test, the students are tested on the assessment, and they have to answer accordingly to the standards. I guess what my bottom line question is, in a state that is very pro-development, I've seen some of the proposed standards for science, and they were not in alignment with what some of our jobs are, current jobs are in the state of Alaska. So the assessment is concerning to me, and making sure that the standards do align with the assessment, and that the teachers don't end up testing to this national standard that may not really truly allow these students to become ready for the jobs. So is there going to be some sort of an evaluation system through the board that the standards are very much aligned with what the jobs are available in the state, so that the career and job ready people can actually, get jobs up here? And I hope I made myself clear. I know we're in a long roundabout way, but
if I might, I'm going to pitch in here because I think I know what she meant, but I got to tell you, it sounded interesting. And what I think that she meant is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there are standards, and I think she used the word standard at times that she may have meant assessments. And so what I think that if we have science standards, what I think she wants to, I don't want to speak for you, but sometimes they got, I think as a resource development state, we always want to be aware that we never teach differently than what our values of this state are. And as a resource development state, we certainly don't want to go into another territory that is foreign to what our values as a state are. I think that's where she was going with that question. And if I might piggyback on that same question, there's a challenge in that we would teach to a test, and there are tests that I take and I can think of as a pilot. I want somebody to teach me what's on the test, because ultimately I want to pass the test so I can continue flying. So teaching to the test has a bad connotation, but at the same time, if I need to pass the test, I would beg that the teachers teach me what's on the test. So two things, our values that the state of Alaska has as far as resource development. I think that's what you were
one of many examples.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt here, and then because we're going to put some of these questions in, that we should be testing to skills. Mm-hmm. It's what these tests should be doing. So the test should be based on skills. So if my third grader is taking a test, that test should show, especially a reading one, that he has all the skills that he needs as a third grader to be able to read, because we're giving this at the end of the year. And if he passes that, then it shows that he's ready for fourth grade. I think where we make our mistakes, that our frustration up here is that we give these tests, but we don't do anything with it. So let's say all of us take the test and we all score differently. It's not like the next week when we go to school, we're all going to get some kind of different curriculum to help us get higher up than what we are. So we're just really testing to see if the material that's being utilized in those schools are giving this, it's going towards the standards, which are skills. I mean, it really shouldn't be based on values, or if we're doing it correctly. And I think that's where your concern is making sure that we don't put a test before our children that are more value-based versus standards. Yes, no?
Pretty much that goes. Just, that there's no national political agenda or anything, such as that may be in conflict with the jobs that are available, in the state.
So, to the chair, these standards really are about reading, writing, mathematics. I think some of the concerns you're raising, we'd have to be very careful when we get into science, or if we ever tested social studies, some of those that do have more value-driven issues with them. That is not the issue with these standards. The items will test those standards. I don't think there's any values agenda that is going to be there, and that's not something the commissioner or the governor would want us participating in. So I can assure you that's the case. The only other thing I'd say about teaching to the test versus teaching to the standards is it's very dangerous to teach the test. Typically, if you're teaching the test, it means a teacher has actually saw the test, which actually is a security violation, and teachers have lost their license for doing such things as that. They get reported to the Professional Teaching Practices Commission. And you also need to keep in mind the next year items change on the test. So if you're teaching to the test versus teaching to the standards, you may be going too focused in your teaching, and you're not teaching kids to do well on the standards, so that when you face a question that's unfamiliar to you but is based on the standards that were written, how do you perform on it? That's what we're trying to prepare students for. So we really work on that. People sometimes categorize it as teaching to the test, but really, we really work to help people teach to the standards and make sure the standards are tested by the test. And the last thing I'll say is we have to actually go through a pretty rigorous alignment process to prove that test the standards. It's rigorous to go through that, and you have to prove that. Otherwise, you can't use the assessment for the requirements in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So hopefully that answers that question.
So since I know you all know how to read, we're going to kind of, really what the next section is, I just kind of wanted you to know that the board has now, the State Board of Education, has passed teacher evaluation. They've passed some school accountability. I guess the part that I really want the department to address, because this is what I heard on the CDs, that, and so those who were unable to hear the Board of Education meeting, you can get CDs made and sent to you, which is what I did. And so we're working on that, just kind of my shot, thank you. But what I want to know on the school accountability, you go into basically the same thing as No Child Left Behind. We're calling them stars instead of levels. So I want to know what the department, where's the black and white portion of it, that if they start falling from, I can't remember what's the highest. So the star level goes on page 23. So there's points to all these stars, and I think as far as what I heard is that we're going to have incentive packages for schools if they meet certain things, and then I guess there'll be plans that will have to be made if they start falling down on the scoring. So I want to hear from the department, what is